everyone, and welcome to Moonbeam Musings, where we talk about all things mysteries and cultural belief systems. Today we have our guest Raphy Mendoza, who is the founder of Co-Create. Co-Create offers one-to-one coaching and community membership for artists and creatives, encouraging artists to put their art into the world with no apology and to be seen for their art. Welcome, Raphy.
Hi.
And today, really interestingly, we're going to be talking about Filipino folklore, because originally you were born in the Philippines, and it's quite interesting how the folklore affects people on a day-to-day basis, but also how it was ingrained culturally over the years as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this because, yeah, it's one of those kind of like strange and wonderful things about the Filipino culture that I don't think it's talked about a lot, particularly. I think, you know, when you first of all, for a while, the Philippines wasn't even on the map. And like when I first came to the UK, I was 11 years old. So that would have been like maybe 2022, 23. No, 2002 or 2003. And I would tell people where I was from, and they would be like, "Well, where's that? That's not a place." And so it's a bit more known now, and I think the Filipino culture, is becoming known in the West largely through food. And you know, if you look on YouTube, if you type in Filipino, the next word that comes up is cuisine or food or street food or something, and that's certainly a big part of the Filipino culture and of any culture. But one thing that isn't spoken about a lot is Filipino folklore. And there's a couple of I can't remember their names, but there's a couple of American uh, YouTubers, I think, or who have gone to the Philippines to try and make sense of Filipino folklore and how it's seen and experienced by Filipinos who live there. And they all come away making less sense of it than than they had before. So it's an interesting conversation in any case.
Amazing, thank you. So let's start off. If you can provide us an overview of the key themes and elements found in Filipino folklore.
Yeah, I mean, when we say folklore, it's a really big um it's a really big thing because we're not just talking about um the commonly known creatures, which the academics refer to as the creatures of lower mythology. So that would be like the kind of like horror-based creatures that are often talked about and is often depicted in Filipino cinema. Then you've got creatures of the higher mythology, which are like the spirits and the gods and the fairies, and they have a neutral relationship with human beings as opposed to the underworld creature who are way more interesting but also way creepier. And then there's also the kind of roots of that, which is for the Filipino ancient history, which is pre-colonial stuff. There's not a lot of written history before colonialism because the places are is an archipelago, so there's lots of different islands with lots of different cultures. But one thing that kind of did tie them all together in some way was animism, which is a spiritual belief that everything that you can see, everything in nature has spirits, and it's that relationship in worship of the spirit that's in everything that is the key, as opposed to a deity where there's a god or several gods. Um, and from there, you can see how the kind of the folklore emerges with all these variants of creatures and spirits and monsters and things that we're going to talk about, and also how it kind of blends with Catholicism, which came after the Spanish. I call it an invasion because it was, and they were there for about 500 years, and so you know it's a kind of you couldn't get away with whatever they were bringing. Part of which was Catholicism.
Okay, so previously, some of the names of the higher mythology would be the likes of the Anito and the Bathala. Is that the right pronunciation?
No, but you're doing better than most. So Anito is like spirits, but they're also kind of like there's like spirits in general, but then you would also have like your personal Anito, which is like your ancestry, the spirits of your ancestors.
Okay.
And so you're always walking around with this like with all of this behind you and around you.
And did people use like prayer, like other cultures would use prayer? How would you communicate with these, especially your ancestors?
I mean, it really depends. It depends on which province. It depends on which part of the Philippines you're talking about. It depends on your own ancestry. So, for example, if you were living in a province and you're quite separate from city urban civilization, and you would still be living primarily in relationship with nature. You'd be living in huts with a small village. You might not necessarily be going to a traditional school. The stuff comes out the same. That's what you eat. That's the culture. And within those villages, there's often a witch doctor or a healer. And if you're that person, you would have come from a lineage of healers, whether that's by blood or by apprenticeship. And how, if you were one of, if that was your calling, if that was your vocation, how you would communicate with the spirits would be within the tradition that you were taught. As a lay person, you'd be influenced by the village's witch doctor. And if you didn't live in a village, if you lived in Manila, you might not have a relationship with these spirits at all. You might be quite westernized in your thinking, and you might so, and in a different tribe, and I certainly haven't seen most of them. There may be more of a ritual around it, and more of a ceremony, and maybe the communication with the spirits are through talismans that you carry around with you, or an altar, and there's a ritual around it, and there may be chants and certain invocations of spirit. Or it could be really subtle, where there's just a certain way of being that you are when you enter parts of the forest or parts of the um, parts of nature, and you approach things with a certain reverence, or you approach herbs and medicine with a certain reverence. So yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because the Philippines isn't one place and it's not one culture in a way.
You've got the higher mythology, as you mentioned before, and then I don't know whether you want to talk any more about them. You said they're part ancestor. Is there anything else around the sort of the gods, if you can
Yeah,
bring
I mean, you'd
or
have
anything?
you'd have the gods. I mean,
Yeah.
it's I don't actually know a hell of a lot of the higher mythology because I just had more exposure to the Aswang as I was growing up. But the Bathala will be gods, and usually they're gods of nature and gods of the elements. So I suppose it's not too dissimilar from Greek mythology, where you've got Zeus, the god of thunder, and you've got uh, you know um,
Dionysus and
yeah,
well,
exactly, and Hecate, and
Aphrodite. Yeah, yeah.
and and so I don't think there's quite as many, and I don't know if there are direct links. And the gods also often appear in different animal shape-shifting forms. Like there's like the Bakunawa, which is the dragon god that eats the moon, which is actually just the eclipse. And there's a lot of kind of academic debate as to whether that comes from original Filipino mythology or whether that was an influence of Chinese or Japanese culture. So I don't know a great deal about. I'm certainly not academically read in all of this. I'm kind of just sharing my own experience of these kind of like concepts and ideas and creatures and beliefs that I was exposed to as I was growing up.
Yeah, well, let's move on to that because it is interesting. So let's talk more about the Ashwang, who, have I pronounced that correctly?
Aswang.
Ashwang, yeah.
Yeah.
About, just a little bit about what they are, and
Mm,
then moving on to maybe some examples from your own life, or what you understood them to be, or how it may have influenced you.
yeah. So the word Aswang itself is interesting because it refers to both a particular type of a shape-shifting creature, which is often female in appearance, um, and it's a monster.
Yeah,
These are not benevolent beings, and it lives, or she lives, among humans, but she's not human.
yeah.
Um, and she has the power to curse people, and she has the power to shapeshift as well and become, a monstrous creature that attacks people and animals. And it's also the word aswang is also used as an umbrella term for a variety of different creatures as well. So there's and which one it is would whether someone's talking about aswang as the individual creature or aswang as an umbrella term would also depend on who you're talking to and where they're from in the Philippines. Um,
So, for
but
example, the tick. Oh, I'm going to say it wrong. Tick balang.
the tikbalang,
Yeah, that would be an example.
that would be an example of one. Manananggal would be an example of one. A capre would be an example of one, and those are like kind of like in the Chanak as well. They're all kind of like monster-like creatures. So for example, you asked about the Tikbalang. That's a um like a horseman. He shows up as the body of a man, a male man, and the head of a horse. And
so that would be a set. In other cultures, that would be called a centaur.
yeah, although a centaur is usually the body and head of a man, like the torso and head of a man, and then like the body and the legs of a horse. So this is in reverse.
Wow. Okay.
And I don't know quite why. It's certainly far less attractive, I would say. And yeah, it's what was the question?
No, sorry, I was asking. Yeah, no, I just intervened there because I'm trying to kind of make a comparison to understand these different creatures. But these creatures are ultimately half and half of things.
Not all of them.
Okay.
Not all of them, but like okay, so like let's take them like one by one, and I'll just do like an overview of each one.
Yeah, maybe like 3 of them, so we can get a feel for what they are.
Yeah. So okay, so the Tikbalang is a half horse, half human, almost centaur-like, but in reverse. So you've got a horse the top part of the body is a horse. You've got a horse's head and a man's body. Usually it's quite muscular, quite heinous, and but like quite a very masculine energy, and there's an argument about whether he's truly evil or whether he's more of like a joker and more of a jester, because one of the things that he likes to do, particularly to outsiders of a village or of a region, is to lead them astray. So if you were to go in the forest or into the woods, he will make sure that you get lost and that you go round and round and round in circles. And he's said to be sitting, to be hiding behind trees, watching you and having a good laugh. And one of the myths is if you are lost in the woods and you suspect that this is the work of a tekbalang, is you have to take your shirt off and turn it inside out and put it back on again, and then you'll break the curse and then you can come out of the woods. So this is one of those superstitions that come along with him. And one of the other superstitions is if you look in the sky and you can see that in half of the sky it's raining heavily and in the other half it's sunny, which in the Philippines is quite uncommon. But in the UK, it's like a daily phenomenon. But if that were to happen, then it's said that the Tekbalang are having a wedding party. And so these are some of the kind of like the myths and the superstitions that come along with this creature. And then there's a debate of whether he's evil or if he's just a joker. There's also a debate on whether he's a protector or whether he's a predator. And so it kind of depends on who you talk to. Depending on where they come from, which village they grew up in, and also who they are personally, because within families you have variations of all of these mythologies, which probably explains why people leave like understanding less about this than when they came, because there's not one agreed reality about any of them.
No. Okay, understood. I guess with going back to that wedding party, that's really interesting. Is it because it's believed that because there's a wedding that he's made it sunny for that part where there's a wedding, or
no, it's nothing that logical.
Okay.
It just is. That's just what
okay
what happens.
it's good to understand that. That's
as far as I understand. I mean, some academic might have dug into it deeper, but I don't think that's a logic. It's just that's just what you're told and you accept it.
Okay, fair enough. That's fine.
And should I tell you about another one?
Yeah, go for it.
I do like these guys. So there's the Manananggal is and she's I think so. I'll explain what she is, and I'll explain why she's my favorite and what I think she represents, which is by no means like what everybody thinks, but it's kind of how I see her mythology. So she's a woman, often like a single maiden woman, a young woman who's usually quite beautiful, in human form, and during the day that's what she is, and at night she goes into the woods and the top half of her body and the lower half of her body separates, and she grows wings, and then her upper half flies around in the night, and she enjoys attacking pregnant women and eating their unborn children, and also the entrails of men. and and then she comes back and she reattaches herself to her lower half of her body, and then she goes back to society and becomes a human being in the day. And it's said that if you are in the woods in the night and you come across the lower half of her body, you should put salt on it. And when she comes back, she won't be able to reattach. And if she's still separated by the time that the sun rises, she'll burn and disintegrate and die. So that's the myth around her. And she's also often depicted as a young woman who's been heartbroken by a man, and whether it's through unrequited love or being betrayed, usually the latter. And what I find interesting about that part of the depiction, which in most movies and most representations is a minor detail, is to me she represents like the collective wrath of women everywhere who, who have experienced not just the betrayal of in romance, but like that's just the general kind of suppression of female power, and it through that suppression, it becomes kind of corrupted into this, kind of vengeful being and vengeful energy that's two-sided. On one hand, beautiful young lady during the day, and a monstrous creature in the evening. And the thing is that both are true, And there's one interesting play that I came across a long time ago that depicted the story of a woman who was betrayed by by a man. She was living in the forest. She was having this quite simple, primitive life. She fell in love, with I think a Japanese soldier who was there during the war. She became pregnant. He betrayed her. He never showed up again. He actually has a family somewhere else. The war ended. He left. She gave birth on her own and was so distraught and angry and confused and just hurt. And she ended up eating her own baby, and then she became this creature, and that was the origin of the Manananggal. And that's fiction, that's like modern fiction to kind of create an origin story about how this creature came to exist. But I thought that was an interesting interpretation of like, well, why is it that this creature is particularly a woman, and the symbolism of being cut in half, really. So like the yin and the yang, and the beauty and the ugliness, the good and the bad, the light and the dark. And yeah, so she's my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because with a lot of cultures, when there's a story, it's usually, well, quite often it's got a lesson to it.
Mm.
So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, what is the lesson really?
Don't fuck with women is the what I got out of that. And I mean, there is probably something something about the duality of human being that's in there. Now, whether that was the original intention of this, it's so hard to say. There's nothing, as far as I know, that's kind of like written and recorded of the history of these things.
Yeah.
And that's why I think one of the reasons why it's hard to get to the bottom of like where did these myths come from, and what role do they play, and what were the lessons that they were trying to teach, is that you can't quite relate to them in the same way that you relate to Greek mythology or Nordic mythology, because in the West we look at Greek mythology and we take it for granted that it's a myth, and we take it for granted that they're fables and tales, and that there are lessons in them, and that they are metaphors for life. Whereas in the Philippines today, 80% of the population believe in the literal existence of these creatures. And so it's very difficult to look at, okay, well, what lessons are they teaching? Because so many of the people who are exposed to this just think they're real. Like there's no lesson in like a tree existing because it just exists. There's no lesson in an iPhone. It's just a phone. It just exists. And so these things are related to in that way, as opposed to like myths and stories. It's like these are creatures that we live with in the forest, and you have to be careful with them.
So, for example, if you were to be a pregnant woman, would there be something you do to mitigate? For example,
Again, in some villages there might be rituals. In some families, you wouldn't leave a pregnant woman to sleep on her own. She would always have somebody with her at night. She would sleep with, if not her partner, her mother or her sister. And in fact, having a female escort is usually safer. And so it has, you kind of have women kind of sticking together. And families are raised like that, like the nuclear family of, there being a mother and a father and a child, and the belief that we need both mother and father as role models. Not that it's not true in the Philippines, but that's just less prevalent. What the child needs is a village, and a whole colony of adults who will share its upbringing, and women definitely play a much larger role in that. And it's not that fathers aren't important, but when it's in a less of a nuclear family situation, it becomes less about mother and father, and it just becomes about community.
Mm.
And so the community will protect the woman, the pregnant woman, from the man that can.
Understood. Yeah.
So, but speaking of lessons, the last one I'll talk about, and it's also one of my favorites, is the Nuno sa Punso, which is, Nuno is like a dwarf.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I kind of see them more like as mini granddads, and a punso is like an anthill or some kind of like mud hill that's like naturally occurring. And so Nuno sa Punso is a dwarf that lives in these anthills in the forest, and um, they're generally benign creatures, but very wise. And if you go into the forest, you have to recite a chant. In some cultures, there's, and I was taught to recite a chant that essentially declares your presence and asks them to please step out of your way, because you can't see them, they're invisible, and you don't want to hurt them, and you don't want to hurt their homes. So please, excuse me as I'm passing through. And what's interesting about that is that in the chant, it's less about um it's less about asking for anything, but it's more about declaring your presence. And it's less about asking for protection, and it's more about acknowledging that these creatures live there and that this is their home. And personally, I take that even further. So it's not just that the forest is their home and these anthills are their literal houses, but they're also custodians of the forest, which means they're custodians of the earth, and their spirit and their being there and their existence is to protect the land from human destruction. And if you were to not recite this chant and you accidentally kicked one of them, or you kicked the anthill, or you fell over and destroyed something, then they have the power to make you unbearably unwell. And there have been stories of people becoming unwell, and modern Western doctors in the Philippines have not been able to solve the problem. And the witch doctor would recommend something like a ritual, or like an apology, like an offering, going back to the forest to offer some food, to offer something to these spirits, and that's the only thing that would have cured them. And there are many stories, demonstrating that works. Now, whether it's true or not, or if it makes scientific sense, or if there's a kind of more medical explanation as to what went on, it's kind of besides the point. I think there's something really beautiful about acknowledging, that, yeah, like, spirits live in the forest, and we have to respect that. And there are spirits that are there to protect the earth from our own unconsciousness as human beings.
Yeah.
So yeah, so what are they evil if they make you ill? I don't know, but I mean, if I were one of them, I would probably do the same thing. I'd be pretty pissed off if somebody came and just like kicked my house and destroyed everything because they weren't thinking. Cool thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's three of the ones that I can talk about.
Thank you. I think that's interesting. How about the story of Maria Macaulay? How do you
Maria Macaulay it's one of the kind of well-known ones, but it's only well-known in the north. So that's why I mean, like, the Philippines isn't like one place.
And your family's originally from Manila.
My family's originally from Manila, but and my family, like, my direct relatives, they're not big believers in this. They're a bit like, probably they think that these are myths, but um they wouldn't necessarily fight against people who believe that these are true either. So they maintain a kind of neutral position. And I didn't learn a lot about all of this from my direct relatives, but rather from my nanny, who came from a village called Capiz, which is in Visayas, which is further south of Manila. and it's known to be the capital and the headquarters of all the Aswang. And so she basically gave me all of my knowledge about these creatures, and she didn't teach them to me like, like as stories and as kind of like fun lessons. They were like, don't go out because because the manananggal will come and eat you, or like, yeah, they were kind of like told us like cautionary. They were cautionary tools to stop you from doing dangerous things as a child. And because Manila is also like bereft of forests, so that's also one of the reasons why most people think that the Aswan don't really go to Manila, because there's nothing interesting there for them,
Mm.
which is possibly true. If I were one of these nature spirits, I would not come to Manila. I wouldn't come to Manila now anyway, either. Sorry. Um, so, but yeah, so what was the question? Something about.
Yeah, I was asking. No, that's good. It's interesting. Thank you for your background, because I think it's important for people to understand your perspective. I mean, you've been living in the UK for many, many years now, but
Yeah,
your perspective of where you're brought up was in a specific region. Is probably
yeah,
quite important, because other people may have a different perspective from the
yeah,
Philippines in the south.
yeah,
So, my question was around Maria McKilling.
yeah.
I don't know whether you want to tell that story.
Yeah. So Maria Makiling is a nature spirit. So she was known as a Dewata, which is a very a very beautiful being of light, really. Like if you listen to the word in the Filipino kind of like dialect, you know, it has a particular energy of being a light being, almost like a star. So she's a nature spirit, and she's seen as benevolent but also powerful, and certainly not somebody that you'd want to piss off. And she resides and is named after a volcano called Mount Makiling, which is in Laguna in the Tagalog region. Um, Tagalog is known as a national language, but actually only a very small percentage of people speak it in the north, in Manila and surrounding areas. And that's worth noting because that area, the north, is where the Spanish had settled. And with Manila being an archipelago, there's a distinct Filipino-ness. They're really all the different islands really have its own culture and its own history and its own original tribes. And so when the Spanish came and settled in the more northern part, that's where Catholicism was most integrated. It did filter down to the Visayas region as well. But interestingly, in Mindanao, which is the most southern part of the Philippines, it's primarily Muslim. And so the reason that's interesting is because Maria Makiling symbolizes protection, nurturance, and generosity, and she's Mother Earth. And yet, and her name is, with Maria, and the clothes that she's often represented in, which is like these kind of like white clothy dresses, that's very reminiscent of the Virgin Mary's clothes. She's often dressed in white and blue, and similarly with Maria Makiling, it's often white, and on occasion, more modern interpretations, she's also wearing blue. And so we can see here, and she's also described as, a beautiful maiden untouched by human corruption, which has the links with the Virgin Mary and, the Immaculate Conception and all of this thing and that kind of like mother energy. And so we can see how the Filipinos, instead of rejecting Catholicism or suppressing it or negating the existence of pre-colonial culture, which is this belief in nature spirits, we kind of just blended them, which is quite typical of Filipino culture as far as philosophical conflicts go. They're just simply dissolved because there's just a kind of undiscerning acceptance of anything. So, rather than, and if you were to ask somebody, well, animism and all of these creatures, wouldn't they go against, the basic principles of Catholicism? They wouldn't challenge you, they wouldn't argue with you and say, no, of course it doesn't. They would just say, yeah, it's possibly conflicting, but it's just not a problem that it's a conflict. Like it's not a problem that there appears to be two opposing truths. And yeah, so no, it doesn't make sense, but that it doesn't make sense isn't a problem for us.
Wow. Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it, in the Western world to kind of comprehend that the logic. I mean, a lot of my questions are quite logical, and yet
and I can't answer them.
No, well, no, because that's the way the cultures are kind of accept a really deep-grained acceptance of these belief systems and mythology.
And
but
and all of these people, they'll go to church as well. religiously. They'll go to church every Sunday and also carry around talismans and recite these chants as they go in the woods and protect their women from these creatures and go
Mhm.
to church in their daily lives.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's just difficult because when you come from a different culture, that doesn't make sense, but in that culture, it does.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
about community, and
Yeah,
churches are also about community.
yeah, and I think if there's that's right. If there's like one kind of key attribute of the Filipino culture is that it's very community centric, for better or worse. It's like community is everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of specific rituals and festivals, are there any that are still practiced that you know of you want to talk about?
Um. So there's one festival which is quite modern. It's a very modern interpretation of and not even interpretation, but like a celebration
Yeah.
of the culture. And I think it happens in Cebu, but it's in one of the bigger cities outside of Manila, where it's literally like a parade. The whole city gets involved, and everybody dresses up in costumes. And
Okay.
there's this one, and then there's just like a parade. There's a party, there's music, there's street food. It goes on for like 48 hours non-stop, and everyone's dressed in whatever aswang they choose. So it's kind of like this, almost like a westernized Halloween interpretation of a festival with a Filipino twist. And so that's a modern thing. And I think I think a lot of people, particularly the younger generation, see it as a celebration. And I think a lot of the older generation may see it as blasphemous because it could be seen as a disrespect of these spirits or of these creatures who are very powerful, and it's a risky thing to be dressing up as them.
Okay, so they don't see it as a
Yeah.
celebration of them, and in honor of them. It's not done in honor of them. It's more.
I think the younger generation and the people who organize the festival would see it as that it's a celebration of Filipino culture and it's a celebration of these spirits. But I think much of that is also because the younger generation are beginning to see these creatures as myths. They're beginning to see these creatures as stories that we were told as children, whereas the older generation still sees it much more as like as its reality. And so I think we are having that transition between the generations. And there was also something that came out quite recently. This doesn't really answer your questions, but I just came to mind. But there's a something that came up, an animation on Netflix called
Mm,
13. And it, if you want to learn about these creatures, that's a really good
yeah.
entry way to watch. Because it's an animation, and it has a kind of like Japanese anime feel almost in the way that it's
Mm,
put together. Not quite, because it came from like a series of graphic novels written by a Filipino who, I don't know the details, but I think it's a collaboration between somebody who was living in the Philippines, a Filipino living in the Philippines, and a Filipino living in the US. And it came out of a series of graphic novels, and it was created into a Netflix series. And that's, I see that as a celebration of these creatures and a celebration of this culture and a celebration of our heritage as Filipinos, many of whom have migrated all over the world, particularly to the US. And so that's the spirit in which I receive it, and I think how it was intended. But I can also imagine people who are of the older generation who who still kind of hold these beliefs and hold these superstitions and hold these creatures as kind of pillars of their reality almost, and like features of their lives and everything they've known that they've grown up, may not receive it in the same way because it's not, this isn't mythology that we're celebrating, this is their reality.
yeah, I understand. Understand. Yeah, and
And
uh, and there's various ways of warding them, the belief system of warding them off as well.
yeah. So the various ways of warding off the aswang, as we're told, in which are about as crazy as the aswang themselves. But so like in the West, we have vampires, and we just rely on garlic to ward them off. But in the Philippines, depending on which village, which region, which person, which family you talk to, you can use coins, you can use rubber tires, you can use slippers, you can use ginger, you can use soy sauce. It depends on who you ask. And there are things that you need to do to, rituals that you can take to protect yourself and to protect your home. And the resourcefulness of the materials that you can use also speaks of the Filipino culture as well. And I suspect that at some point there was like one ritual that you would use. Maybe it was like the coins because they were silver and copper or something that would ward off these creatures. And for lack of coins, because of poverty, you might just like choose something else, and then that gets translated into something else, into something else. But the power, of these objects' ability to ward off the spirits remains the same, even though because that's just how it happens. And so, yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, it really does depend on who you ask, for sure.
And you mentioned something before about the cenaculo.
Yeah, the Cenacolo, which is like, again, we kind of see like the Catholic influence in the culture. The Cenacolo is a kind of like a theatrical reenactment of the Passion of the Christ, the crucifixion, that we put on the streets in public, in in various regions during Easter. And it's, and the reenactment's quite literal. So there would be like almost like a parade that mimics how Jesus was paraded through the streets in Jerusalem, wherever it was. And and up until the point where he was nailed to the cross, and all the people watching, and Mary Magdalene being there, and the other two criminals that he was crucified with, and the three crosses. The whole thing is like reenacted like live, in real time during Easter. And people do get literally nailed to the cross. There's like a specific way that you do it. You allow yourself to be nailed to the cross if you were the actor playing this part. And that's very much a Christian celebration that, that has little to do with animism. And yet you can still see how the ritualization of that and the literality with which we take that those events happened in the way that they did, literally, and that our way of celebrating that is in a very literal way, I think also speaks a little bit to the part of Filipino culture that kind of accepts realities, and accepts stories, and accepts myths in a very literal way. And that's
Yeah,
literally what happened, you know, in in the same way that the Aswang is real, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary were real. Like, there's no kind of
mm,
taking it as symbols. It's like Jesus Christ's death wasn't symbolic. He died, and then he ascended, and he went back to God.
yeah.
So, and that's not in conflict at all with the Aswang. Yeah, yeah.
So so moving on to sort of how, I think we've touched on it, but how these myths and or realities for some influence daily life. How do you feel your own daily life was influenced by Filipino folklore? In England we have superstitions like not walking under ladders, and I will think about it every time I do walk under ladders. Every time I go to walk under a ladder, I will think of the superstition. Um,
Mm.
are there kind of daily beliefs that you feel actually, if you think about it, they're still prevalent in your life right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's like when I think about, like, for instance, when I was talking about Nuno Supunso, the little granddads who live in the anthills, um, and you would recite this chant as you would walk through the forest. If I looked at it objectively, yeah, of course it's a superstition, right? Like, how could there really be those beings living there? And you're encouraged to recite these chants so that you don't get cursed and you don't become ill, and that's a superstition. And yet at the same time, I do, even in non-Filipino forests, when I walk through the woods, like inside my head, particularly when it's dark and I can't see where I'm going, I would recite this superstition either to myself or out loud, or this chant, because it is a way of acknowledging that there are spirits in the forest. And personally, I would say that there are spirits in the forest, and that's a reality for me. Not necessarily the Mandangal, not necessarily, the Tekbalang, but and I don't necessarily worship trees, and but they're alive. The woods
Yeah,
are alive, and so if things are alive, they have spirit, which I suppose is the core of animism. And so to recite this chant is an acknowledgement and a respect of the beings that live there, and an acknowledgement that as human beings, we don't own anything. We don't own the earth. And to acknowledge that we're passing through um, a shared space is polite. I can't really think of a word that like a better word, but it's like it's just what you would do. It's just not being a dick, basically. Like, but obviously, like, I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't do this are being dicks, but it's like if I really think about it, what were the lessons that I took from these teachings? What were the lessons that I took from these superstitions that I was given as a child? It's like, no, respect the spirits of the forest.
Is it, in a way, do you think it's like being more mindful? We can get in our heads or not thinking off with the fairies, not really thinking about what we're doing. And
Yeah.
in a way, it's about whatever you're doing, being more mindful.
Yeah, and like bringing a consciousness to what you're doing, and it's like and not that there's nothing wrong with going for a walk in the forest and just like being in your own thoughts and just putting one foot in front of the other, and we will get incredible benefits just from being in the forest. But while we're there getting those benefits, like, isn't it worth acknowledging that we're here for a time and that we're passing through? And maybe there aren't tiny mini granddads living in anthills all over the place, and you're not going to kick them and they're not going to make you ill. But isn't it worth acknowledging the spirits that are there, whether they're going to make you ill or not? And just say, hey, I'm passing through. Have a nice day. So I can't remember what the original question was.
It was how this has influenced you, and I think we can hear through what you're talking about, how it's influenced you throughout your life, with some of the things that you may do, like in the forest.
And I think there's also something about there's a playfulness to all of it. If you look at pictures and depictions of these creatures, they look horrific. But I particularly like the interpretation of the Tikbalan being a jester who just kind of like makes you be lost. And maybe that's something that I kind of like. I have a fondness of, because I do get lost all the time. Like 5 minutes away from my own house, like I get lost, and this from experience of being with me in any place. And it's like, and so there's a fondness that I have for that interpretation of like, oh yeah, he's just kind of behind trees, like having a laugh while you're lost, and you have to turn your t-shirt inside out so that you can find your way back. And there may be some neuroscience to that. You're kind of interrupting a pattern. You're kind of stopping what you're doing, you're stopping the search while you're kind of honing in, and you're like seeing through a very narrow lens, and you just do something ridiculous, and then suddenly you can see.
Yeah, I relate to that. So my sense of direction of that. So, thank you. Yeah, that's great. So just a couple more questions, really. Do you think, for example, some of the examples of how it affects day-to-day culture, not just for yourself but other people, with regards to traveling? We've mentioned about pregnant women and being escorted, and what about traveling at night or building homes? Have you got any examples of that?
Yeah, so like, I mean, the building homes is interesting because, like, I think there's probably like Chinese feng shui influences in some of it as well, which is definitely not a myth. And if you think it is, you should speak to like airports and the billion-dollar industry that it is, because quite a lot of them employ feng shui masters and consultants for how they create, for wealth and for safety and for all of that stuff. So I can't speak much about it, but definitely not a myth. But for instance, with building houses, you're supposed to not build them facing west, because the sun sets in the west, which symbolizes death and endings. And so if you build your house facing in that direction, you're inviting that energy into your home.
Okay.
And like I said, I don't know if that is a feng shui influence, but it sounds like it could be. And if it is, then it's probably not a superstition. It's probably real. And then there's also the burying. It's quite common another thing to say. It's quite common in the Philippines to build your own houses. Maybe that's changing with population and modernization, particularly in cities. But you don't just go around buying houses like you do in the UK. You'd buy something from the Victorian era, because we don't have a Victorian era. We were still living in mud huts in the Victorian era. And so it's quite common to like buy land and build your houses. And so it's common practice to bury coins and money in the foundations of the house to bring in wealth. And again, I don't know if that's a feng shui thing, but to me that makes sense. It's, if not for the literality of it, the intention of offering something. It's like an investment. You offer like a handful of coins and you get back £10. And the kind of like the intention behind that ritual is something that I think makes sense to a lot of people. And in terms of like traveling around, like I remember my nanny used to always have um a bottle of oil in her bag. It's a specific kind of oil. I can't remember what it is. I think it's coconut oil or coconut and something oil, and a small bottle of it in a brown jar, and you keep it in your bag at all times. And if you walk by an aswang who's in human form, it will explode in your bag, and so that's how you know. And be careful.
Oh, wow.
And talismans as well. And so like my nanny always she gave me and I wore it all the time, a little pendant with the baby Jesus on it.
Mm.
And that's a talisman against aswaks as well, which again shows you the the blending of
Yeah,
Catholicism with this culture. And it's like, oh, that's become a talisman. And
yeah.
it's like, whether semi-precious stone, baby Jesus, same thing. Yes, that will work. And so that was my talisman as I was growing up. A lot of people use the rosary as well, so a lot of people have a rosary in their handbag. And I think in the West, but maybe like in places like Italy where it's a very strong religion, like people would carry
Mm.
rosaries so that they can
Hmm.
pray, whereas we
Yeah,
would carry rosaries to protect us from these creatures.
yeah, you can see it. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
So and we use them to pray as well, but that's kind of like like that's a bonus.
So, are there any other rituals or community gatherings that you might find in maybe southern countries
Yeah.
or?
So like I said earlier, like in s- more provincial areas where you'd have smaller, more tight-knit villages,
Mm,
and you don't necessarily have the modern infrastructures of going to school and going to work and having a hospital, that's just not a thing. You would have a witch doctor, and you would have kids play together and be looked after by the community and learn how to fish or learn how to farm and learn how to tend to the rice fields. So that's their world, and it's small. And if somebody were to get sick, you would have people in the community gather around that person on their sick bed. And sometimes people will come at various times. They would say the rosary with you next to your bed, or they will eat around you and offer up the food before they eat it to the healing gods and the spirits. If there's a witch doctor, they may, they'll do certain rituals as when they smoke your aura, like
yeah,
a cleansing through by burning herbs and
yeah,
not necessarily incense, but like certain herbs. And again, like invoking the spirits. And sometimes if it's a particularly persistent disease, they would try and communicate with either the ancestors or the spirits and find out who you wronged, and it may be something that's happened from a really long time ago,
mm,
and you have to tell your sister what you did, um and ask for forgiveness. So it's really about making whole, in a way. And so all of that could happen in in various settings, and the style of the witch doctor would also depend on his or her lineage. They might
mm.
be more using herbs, or they might be more channeling the spirits, and particularly ancestral spirits.
Are
And
there, are there
yeah,
any songs, like songs that, or chanting or songs that people would use around the, ashwang, or did you have any kind of nursery rhymes or anything like that sort of thing?
I don't remember many nursery
No.
rhymes. No, not myself. Not that maybe it's not that there weren't any. I do remember having a witch doctor. Like I grew up in Manila, and my mum would normally first send me to like a proper doctor, a Western doctor, a GP type person. And I remember once I just like was so ill. It was like the flu or something, and I also had asthma, and so it was just persistent, and it just went on for weeks. And it wasn't I was checked for tuberculosis, and it wasn't that, and nobody knew what it was. And so eventually my mum conceded and said, and allowed my nanny to consult the witch doctor. And she had asked for, or was it a he, my t-shirt that I was wearing that day. And she took it to the witch doctor, and they did some cleansing and some reading. and it just said something about one of my ancestors was communicating something, and it had a message for my mum. I don't know what that was. My nanny talked to my mum about it. This is my memory of it. And then and then he asked my nanny to say 3 rounds of the rosary for me next to my bed, and then I think I was well 2 days after that. So I don't. I mean, again, it could have just been like a natural passing of a disease, but what I did feel in all of that was looked after. You know, like my nanny had a certain intention about me getting better that was very clear to me as a child. And
Mm.
witch doctor or not, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And I'm sure there's another podcast talking about South American shamanism and things.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
today
Yeah.
because that's interesting.
It's a different
Um,
day. Yeah.
just to wrap up, I guess maybe it'd be good to do a comparison. I think for me, it helps me to learn by comparing, even though just as initially to be able to ascertain kind of what someone's talking about. And one of the things that you mentioned was the parallels between Filipino folklore and global superstition. So just
Mm.
maybe taking some of the creatures that you've mentioned and grouping them or looking at what they might be similar to.
Yeah. I mean, uh, the- a lot of these creatures are certainly like nighttime creatures. Like the capre, which I didn't talk about earlier, but he's depicted as a tall, dark man wearing a hat and smokes a cigar, sitting on trees. And there's a debate as to whether he's a predator or whether he's actually protecting the house or the home or the village. And I don't know quite what he would be the equivalent of in Western mythology. And that the Tikbalam, the horseman, is I suppose it's a bit like Pan, from the Shakespeare,
Yeah.
but the Shakespeare depiction of Pan, because he's quite or the way I see him or choose to see him is he's quite playful, but also
Mm.
like Pan, like the god of sexuality. It's like he has like the way that his body is represented, the male body is has that energy about it, like male virility.
Mm.
Um, quite how Pan would have made it to Filipino ancient history, I don't know, but maybe we all just need a cultural idol for male virility. I don't know. And the Chanak, which is the spirit of an aborted baby, it's a bit like Chucky, the 90s or 80s film of the possessed doll.
Mm.
Um, that's the closest thing that I can um make a parallel to. So
Mm.
I mean, a lot of these like threads are pretty loose, I would say. And I think the Mananagal is kind of one of a kind. She's a bit like a harpy, I suppose. Um, and she's often depicted with like a shrieking harpy voice.
Okay. Yep.
And yeah, the tick tick is weird because like I don't actually know what it's supposed to look like because all I remember is if you can hear the tick ticking sound, like if you hear that and it sounds like it's far away, that means that she's very close. And if it's very loud, that means she's far away. But then if you ask somebody else from a different region, it'd be the opposite. So you're never really safe from the tick tick. And they go for children, particularly naughty one. So I think maybe that's just one of the ones that was used to kind of like get children to behave and be quiet.
Yeah, I think I had the man in a van.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That
You
thing.
see that makes more sense though. That's like logical. Like
If I left the house on my own when I was very young, man in the van will come and get you, take you away.
yeah. And I'm just looking it up to see if there's like physical depictions of it because I just had this like invisible noise. Um Something about black cats, crows, and if yeah. Anyway, that's that's
We
what it
can
is.
have a look and leave a note below if we find anything. But
Yeah.
okay, yeah,
Oh, even the googling is contradictory. It's
yeah.
hilarious. So like it says that it's another term for the manananggal. It's not, from my memory. And then another one that says tik tik is a creature with a form of bird-like human. It's similar to the wak wak, which I thought was exactly the same as each other, and are both winged humans who at night search for victims. They hunger for flesh and blood, especially to those of leprosy. And then yeah, so there's a lot of sources that say it's similar to to it's the same creature as the Manananggal, but the wak wak, how I was told that when I was younger, was it was a winged human, but it was a bird body with a human face, like a beautiful human face of a
Mm,
female and feathered wings, as opposed to the Manananggal who had like bat wings and is ugly and
yeah.
had a very long tongue that it uses to kind of insert itself into the belly button of the pregnant woman to eat the child with, obviously.
Wow. Yeah.
So
It kind of reminds me a bit of the flying monkeys in Wizard of Oz, sort of like the
yeah,
like,
yeah, a little bit. I mean,
okay.
those are a little cuter and less kind of traumatic looking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, is there anything else you wanted to add before we close today?
um no, I mean, like, just I acknowledge, like, we didn't go that deep into anything, and if people did want to um kind of go into it a little bit deeper, there's a couple of very detailed academic style research into this topic. And I say
Hmm.
academic style because that's about as academic as it could possibly get, I suppose. And I haven't got the books on me now, but I'll look them up,
Yeah, I'm
and
going to put everything below.
and
I'm
then
going
you can look it up on
to.
on the thingy at the bottom of the video. And I would encourage having a look at those sources, because it's very hard to go into depth with these things because there's not one real answer, because so much of it is very much lives in the lived reality and the lived experiences of different communities. And because conflict isn't conflicts isn't something that's kind of like ironed out in the way that we would in the West, where you would like have a debate and then you would like look at evidence and then you would, and you would like figure out like what's true or what's most likely true, and where you could trace it from the country's origins in history. It doesn't really, that's not what happens. People we kind of just like accept certain things and elements, and then it's malleable and it changes. And so
Mhm.
there's not one answer. So I suppose I'm just acknowledging that a lot of people watching this may be leaving the conversation more confused than they were when they came. And I'm sorry about that, but that's what happens when you have this particular conversation.
Well, no, see, I think if you accept that there's not a logical explanation for a lot of this,
Yeah, yeah.
um, you've categorized some of the creatures and given us some examples of creatures, and we've got some examples of what they might be like in other cultures. I think that's great. It gives us more of an insight into
Mm,
the Filipino culture and what drives it and where it came from, and how it's very interesting because how it's kind of amalgamated with Catholicism and
mm.
with folklore, and they work together in a way that
You know,
seems quite balanced, but doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, that's a good
I think that's
summary.
great. I think it's
That's a really
great.
good summary, actually. Yeah, let's leave it there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Raphy. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of people will find this very interesting. So I'll also put your details of your website and all the courses you're running below in the links, so people can contact you if they want to and they're interested. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.